This is a three-part series on how Saint John Bosco fought monastic suppression laws that would allow the confiscation of church property in 1855. So basically legalizing theft of Catholic-owned buildings and land in Italy. Don Bosco sent prophetic letters to the king that warned him of his impending doom if he allowed these terrible laws to go through. It's a fascinating series of events, and I'm very excited to tell you about it. The Miracles and Prophecies of Saint John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Catholics lived in fearful expectation of the monastic suppression law and its consequences. Don Bosco had already published the charter of the founding of Alta Comba, listing all the curses imposed on those who would dare to confiscate that property. In April, he worked with the Rebukes publishing house on a booklet by Baron Nilens entitled Stealing Church Property and Its Consequences. It featured a quote from St. Ambrose: "A private citizen's home is inviolable, and yet you dare lay hands on the house of the Lord." The book covered many centuries of battle between the church and the state and described the dreadful punishments that fell upon those who stole, sold, or bought goods consecrated to God. It showed the consequences for those who despoiled the church, religious orders, and their families. Hence the frightening proverb, "The family of those who steal from God shall not attain the fourth generation." Don Bosco's book caused great commotion. In the minds of many, the book instilled a powerful, beneficial fear that convinced them not to acquire property seized from the church. The police were intimidated by the book because they feared its effect on the people. Some talked of confiscating and censoring the book, but they decided it was better to pay no attention to it. A deputy named Proferio judged the book to be an insulting provocation aimed at Parliament. He shouted that its author should be punished. However, no one supported his rant, and nothing was done. Meanwhile, on April 23rd, the debate in the Italian Senate began. Opinions were divided, and arguments sometimes degenerated into fights intended to silence the eloquent Catholic orators. The debate had gone on for 3 days, when Senator Monsignor di Calabiana, Bishop of Casalem, attempted to reveal the hypocrisy of the enemies of the clergy. After consulting with the other bishops, obtaining the Holy See's approval, and warning the king, the bishop offered to pay the government 928,412 lire to withdraw the proposed law on behalf of Rome. This sum would have come out of the current year's diocesan budget and was originally intended to fund the endowments of parish priests on the mainland. Hypocritically so, the government was uncomfortable with this proposal. The fraudulent reason for suppressing the convents was precisely to raise the money to fund these same endowments. Count Cavour, who was working to unify Italy, begged the Senate to suspend its sessions because King Victor had looked favorably on Rome's proposal. The king's wife and mother had strongly pleaded with him to defend the persecuted church. He felt ready to accept the conditions offered by Rome. But the next day, April 27th, the cabinet ministers resigned. General Giacomo Durando was tasked with assembling a new cabinet to meet under 2 conditions. 1, to include men who would think like the old ministers, and 2, to agree to the deal with Rome. These conditions contradicted each other and highlighted the great disturbance stirring in the king's soul as the old ministers were anti-Catholic. Consistent with their dirty tricks, the sectarians were trying to influence the king. The newspapers threatened an uproar if Rome's proposal was accepted and Count Cavour did not return to power. The university students shouted, "We support the bills to disband the monasteries," while the rabble threatened violence. Senators who opposed the bill were insulted in the streets, and the mob shattered the windows of Monsignor Enzini's residence where the Bishop of Casale was staying. The authorities were publishing illegal and poorly timed declarations. Daily reports were sent to the king to announce non-existent uprisings in the provinces. The king constantly received letters from high-ranking public officials threatening resignation. He was also distressed by the sudden arrival of some military leaders who declared that they would abandon the Crimean expedition if the king approved new cabinet members they didn't like. There were even military forces deployed under the windows of the king's palace, ready to dispel imaginary rebellions. It was absolute chaos. Maximus d'Azeglio heard that the king seemed to be against the bill to dissolve the monasteries, and he immediately tried to speak to him. He went to the palace, but wasn't allowed in. Then he dared to write a letter to the king in the following words on April 29, 1855. Your Majesty, believe your faithful servant who has served you, mindful only of your welfare and the good of the country. With tears in my eyes and kneeling at your feet, I tell you, do not go further down the path you're on. You still have time. Resume the path you were on before. In a single day, a sly group of friars has succeeded in destroying the work of your reign, agitating the country, shaking the charter, and obscuring your royal name. There isn't a moment to lose. Official statements did not settle the matter the last time. We have been told that the crown wanted to seek new advice. Let the crown say that Rome's offer is unacceptable. Let things follow their natural constitutional course as they did before. Piedmont will put up with everything, but we will not be put under the priestly yoke again. No. Thus ended the letter. Meanwhile, General Durando attempted uselessly to form the new cabinet for 8 days. But the whole idea was a farce. When the Senate assembled on May 3rd, General Durando declared that the former minister, Count Cavour, was now the prime minister. The Count immediately demanded, of course, that the Senate continue discussing the Ratazzi law dissolving the monasteries, and thus scheduled the debate for May 5th. While the ill-fated project was being debated in the Senate, on May 17th, the royal house was again consumed with mourning. Earlier that year, on January 8th, the late Queen Maria Adelaide had given birth to a baby boy. The child, who until then had been in excellent health, suddenly became critically ill and died. Within 4 months, the king had lost his mother, wife, brother, and son. Don Bosco's dream about these deaths had indeed turned out to be truly prophetic. Unfortunately, on May 22nd, with a vote of 53 to 42, the Senate approved the law suppressing religious communities. The law included some modifications. The religious orders that the law named were suppressed, and all their property was to be immediately seized. But the community members would be allowed to die in their convents. However, this clause required them to live in houses designated by the cabinet, supported by an allowance corresponding to the community's original net income. Deploring this evil, Don Bosco requested many institutes in the city to pray. He urged his young men not only to fulfill certain practices of piety, but also to fast on bread and water. They all obeyed. On one of these days, Don Bosco was in the refectory after dinner. He talked about the new law with many of the clerics: Turchi, Ravilio, Angelo Savio, Franchesia, Caliero, Rua, and others. Don Bosco said, "All that's missing is the signature of Victor Emmanuel, and then many convents will be destroyed. If I could just speak to the king, I would say, 'Your Majesty, don't approve this law. Otherwise you will bring many more misfortunes upon you and your family.'" Some of those present questioned him, "Would it be a good idea for some of us to write to the king?" Don Bosco replied, "Certainly." "Savio, do you feel like writing down what I say?" "I do," replied Angelo Savio. "Go ahead." Don Bosco dictated a letter on Angelo Savio's behalf. "Tell him this: Your Majesty, yesterday I happened to be talking with Don Bosco and others about the Ratazzi Bill just passed by the Senate. Don Bosco said, 'If I could only speak with His Majesty, I'd say, Your Majesty, do not sign this bill. It would be a warrant for more calamities for you and your family. I am apprising you of this as a loyal, devoted, and respectful subject.'" The cleric wrote down what Don Bosco had dictated and signed his own name. However, Don Bosco was not yet satisfied. Prompted by an inner impulse that allowed no delay, he wrote a short note to the king in Latin, repeating his previous warning: "Dicit Dominus, erunt mala super mala in domo tua. The Lord says, evils upon evils will fall upon your house. Don Bosco no longer implored. He now threatened greater punishments should the king sign the bill. Don Bosco hastened to send the letter to one of the king's chief valets, a man in the royal palace who had the confidence of the king. His name was Oquiena. He was from Castelnuovo, a friend and relative of Don Bosco, and his children attended the oratory. The king, unfortunately, had left on the same day for Susa. Signori Oquiena, having received the letter, told the messenger, "Tell Don Bosco that as soon as the king's back, it will be delivered to him. I'll go and put it in his room myself." The messenger said, "But it's most pressing. The king must read it at once." Oquiena said, "Then report to Don Bosco that the letter will be sent instantly." Calling another valet, he ordered him to saddle the horse and handed him the letter to deliver. The valet reached the king at St. Ambrose. "A letter for your majesty," he announced. "A letter?" the king replied. "Give it to someone in the retinue. I'll read it when I'm settled in. Right now, I have other business on my hands." The valet persisted, "But it's most pressing and speaks of things of great importance to your majesty." The king asked, "And who sends it to me?" "Don Bosco," was the reply. The king paused. "Don Bosco writes me things that make me stop and think. Give me the letter." Unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you the rest of the story today, so please come back Wednesday for part 2. In the meantime, you might check out this playlist that I've put together about all of Don Bosco's prophecies. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.